You're listening to Pop Culture Detective Audio Files. In each episode, we investigate the social and political messages embedded in popular media. I'm your host, Jonathan McIntosh, and on today's episode, we'll be analyzing Season 2 of the hit Apple TV comedy series, Ted Lasso.
It's all about believing that everything's going to work out in the end.
Exactly as it's supposed to. And isn't the idea of never give up one of them things we always talk about in sports? And shouldn't that apply to people too?
It's a beautiful metaphor for many of life's journeys.
We did an in-depth discussion of Ted Lasso's first season back on our first episode of this podcast, so feel free to go back and listen to that one if you haven't already. Today, we're going to be focusing on Season 2. The series has continued to garner praise from critics and rack up a whole bunch of industry awards. Ted Lasso received 20 Emmy nominations in 2021 and won 7 of them. Season 2 makes some changes to the Ted Lasso formula and addresses some of the shortcomings in Season 1, especially in terms of representation, though there are still some outstanding issues. On the whole, we get more and deeper character development, and the writers attempt to complicate Ted's happy-go-lucky, wholesome persona. So returning to continue our discussion of Ted Lasso, we have fellow media critics and friends of the show, Amran Siddiqui and Felicia Lopez. Felicia is an assistant professor at the University of California, Merced, in the Department of Literatures, Languages, and Cultures, where her research covers a wide range of topics related to indigenous history, culture, language, and media. Welcome back, Felicia.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Amran Siddiqui is a writer and filmmaker challenging systems of domination. Their writing on white supremacy, patriarchy, and popular media has been published by The Atlantic, Bitch Magazine, and BuzzFeed, among others. They are currently the communications director at Black Star Projects, home of the Scene Journal, and Black Star Film Festival. Welcome back to the podcast, Amran.
Yeah, so great to be here. Excited to talk about this show.
So I think I'd like to start this discussion by highlighting one of the overarching themes of the show, which is men's growth and men's transformation. That's something that we talked about at length in our previous podcast on Ted Lasso, though I think in Season 1, that growth was very personal. And in Season 2, the focus shifts from interpersonal growth to men struggling to be better, but this time with the help of therapy. So we are introduced to Dr. Sharon Fieldstone, the team's new sports psychologist, and we see her treating a bunch of the players over the course of the season. And then finally, she works with Ted himself. I just wanted to ask both of you how you thought the writers handled the topic of counseling in general, because as we've discussed before on this podcast, and as we talked about in our Falcon and the Winter Soldier episode, men in therapy is often handled very poorly in Hollywood. It is often a joke, and it is rarely effective. But here on Ted Lasso, I felt like they did a pretty good job, at least as much as you can within the sort of short comedy format. But, it's not a joke, and it does end up being helpful and effective.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's television, so it starts to creep beyond what seems realistic to some extent. But in terms of just the idea of how therapy is presented in the show, I thought it was welcome, at least. I think the fact that Dr. Sharon eventually has a life outside of being a therapist, and we get to see some of that, and that in the end, it does seem very clear if you walk away from the show, one thing you probably would understand is that it helped Ted.
Yeah, I'll agree with you 100% on that. I think that I know a lot of Americans who are really against seeing psychologists or psychiatrists or therapists. And so being able to address the hangups, the obstacles, the reasons that people create for themselves, forgetting much needed emotional and mental health and support. I appreciated that they take the time to kind of talk about why it's also worthwhile to give it a try, to give therapy a try. And so I thought it was effective in doing that.
I also know a bunch of people who are not just hesitant about therapy, but like hostile, like openly
Yes.
hostile
Mm-hmm.
to the idea. And I feel like a lot of them are men, not all of them, but a lot of them are men. And I felt like the Ted character really embodied that sort of hostility. That conversation that he has where he accuses Sharon of, just doing it for the money and only, you charge me for an hour, but you only work for 50 minutes, right? That kind of stuff rang very true in terms of the excuses a lot of people give. And I actually really liked the conversation that, Ted goes into Rebecca's office and they have that little back and forth about, why would you need a therapist? I can diagnose myself.
You ever been to a therapist, Rebecca?
What for? I can diagnose myself in a heartbeat. I thought being invulnerable would protect me, so I pushed people away for years, leading me directly to my greatest fear. Being alone. Big whoop.
Big whoop. Yeah, I don't get it. Why pay someone to do what a friend should do for you for free?
Exactly. I mean, that's why you have friends, isn't it? I mean, to burden them with your issues and anxieties, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
They both agree, oh, yeah, well, that's what you have friends for, right? And then they ask each other, do you need to talk about anything? And they're like, no, right? Except that we know that they both have a lot to talk about. And they're lying to their friend right there.
But yeah, that was a really wonderful conversation because there's such awkwardness in there, and you can see that they're, I think, kind of highlighting the fact that you don't necessarily want to spill all of your problems to your friend. You maybe want to keep that in a space where you can you can then enjoy your friendship in a different kind of way. You don't want to burden your friends with that.
In a lot of ways, Sharon is the anti-Ted on this show, which I wasn't expecting, and I think that a lot of the audience wasn't expecting it. They chose to bring in a character who seems designed to butt heads with Ted, not only in terms of their personalities, but in terms of their philosophy, their ideology. I mean, Ted is threatened by Sharon because she represents something important, and she represents this challenge to Ted's sort of down-home, folksy solutions, because he goes to fix Danny's problem with his normal Ted quirkiness, and it doesn't work. And the idea that maybe there are things that can't be fixed with Ted's happy-go-lucky, wholesome persona, that there are some things that are deeper, that require focus and professionalism and intentionality to really work out. That's a challenge to Ted's whole character from the first season. And they do that through the character of Sharon, which is a bold move, because at first we don't like her.
Well, Doc.
Doctor.
Right. Yes, of course. Sorry. Doctor. So then you're pretty confident that you can help us out with Danny, huh?
Are you good at your job? Put all bullshit humility aside and be honest with me. Are you good at your job, yes or no?
Yes.
I believe you. Well, as good as you are at your job, I'm twice as good at mine.
We're very lucky to have you.
Thank you. That's good to know. Thank you for coming here.
She's set up to be opposing everyone's favorite character. And not only everyone's favorite character, but his philosophy that everyone from the first season, is so attached to.
Well, I'll say that I was right there when they first introduced her character. I was against her as well. She seemed to be encroaching on the fun, right? It was kind of like the grown-up was entering the room, and that's literally how they kind of present it when Ted Lasso meets her, right? That they're just these boys who are playing with their wadded up paper ball, batting it back and forth, and then the grown-up walks in and says, "What's going on here?" and kind of stops all of the fun. But then, I thought the show did a really great job of making us empathize with her. I felt like I got to know her, and she was an imperfect person. But, as a woman of color myself, I really appreciated that here we have, as far as I can tell, the only person on the show with a higher degree, right? She's very, very well educated. She's a confident woman. She speaks many languages, and she is a strong and independent woman. It doesn't make her perfect. And so they make her flawed. But, I appreciate that they don't try to present her as a perfect person, but she's still a hard-working, good, honest person. And I think, sadly, that those are rare representations of women of color.
When she's presented as like a challenge to Ted and that he's uncomfortable with it. One of the things I think is interesting about that is that there's an undercurrent to that because they are so different, not only in their philosophies, but just also in the way they look. Sharon's a Black woman. And that point about that there's some things that are deeper or require more intentionality than Ted's philosophy might accommodate for, at least it's the way it's presented in season 1. There's like a subtle moment where he picks up a book in her apartment, and it's a book about the Middle Passage, I think, and there's a reference to Black people being enslaved, and that Sharon's reading a book about that. What it to me suggests is that Sharon's perspective or philosophy is informed by a lot, and there's a lot behind what she's saying. I do feel like, again, this is something the show often kind of plays with. It gives you these little like hints, or it'll mention colonization and then just kind of mention it. But I did appreciate in her, as you get to know her better, like you said in the beginning, they're oppositional, but by the end you realize they're maybe after something similar, but that Sharon's trying to go deeper.
A major theme is personal growth. It was in the first season. It is still in the second season. And a little bit of redemption, sort of men finding redemption. We have that with Jamie. I wasn't even sure if Jamie was going to come back. I thought maybe his journey was over after the first season. So I was a little surprised to see him. And he comes back into the show, and he is...
What's that show he's on? What's that reality show?
He's on a show called, what is it called? Like Lust Island or something like that. Yeah, so, he comes back into the show. Jamie comes back into the show. He's still selfish and arrogant and clueless and a bit of a sexist, right? I mean, that's made very clear. But then things start to fall apart for him.
How you been?
Awesome.
Yeah?
Best. Pretty good. Okay. Little depressed. Yeah. It's all shit, Ted.
That was a real roller coaster there. I was tall enough to join you on that ride.
This was, I thought, really interesting. I mean, this was something that I was not expecting. And I was, I appreciated the way they did it because Jamie wants to fit in. He's been brought low. He's no longer the star player. He's no longer beloved. Everyone kind of hates him for good reason. He tormented them. And he's looking for redemption. He's looking to be accepted. And he's terrible at it. He thinks he's going to buy them all PS5s and they're going to love him again. And it turns out that is obviously not the case. And so he has to find another way to be forgiven and to be accepted. And I thought that journey was really interesting. And I especially liked that it really began with the team, at least, and with Sam, with an act of solidarity. Because, Sam and the other Nigerians on the team are going to protest their sponsor. Jamie is the first one, right after his therapy session with Dr. Sharon, too, is the first one to say, I will stand in solidarity with you. And that sort of inspires the rest of the team to do it as well.
And you're reminding me, you're thinking about these themes that are showing up throughout the season. I really thought this was the season of fathers and sons, and a little bit of mothers and daughters, but mostly fathers and sons, and just kind of highlighting the ways that fathers can potentially be quite damaging to their sons.
In this case, like catastrophic.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so in a way it makes Jamie's journey that much more spectacular because he has the most spectacularly awful father on the entire show. And a lot of them have bad fathers on this show. But yes, his is the worst.
Yeah, I mean, I found that moment where he confronts his father to be I mean, one of the most powerful moments I think in the whole show. Jamie's father comes in to the locker room and he's drunk and he's belligerent and he, is belittling his son and just an awful.
And belittling the entire team who's standing there watching.
Yeah. I mean, it's just gut wrenching. And you can see on Jamie's face that he is just wrecked. They get into a bit of an altercation and Jamie just punches him. And it's such a contrast to the way that physical violence is often portrayed, especially face punching. Face punching is almost always a triumphant moment in media, right? The guy deserves it. You punch him, everyone feels better, right? This is like a super trope in media. So the fact that Jamie punched him and it was just dead silence, and you could see that Jamie's starting to tear up, right? As soon as he does it. It wasn't a triumphant moment. It was sad. It was tragic. It was awful. I mean, obviously the father deserved it, but it's not presented as like this feel good moment. I mean, it is supposed to be gut wrenching that this relationship is so terrible that, he ends up being punched by his son. And I mean, you can really feel the anguish in that scene. And there's silence. I mean, Jamie's standing there tearing up. Coach Beard throws him out, throws the father out. No one moves. You've got this, this star player suddenly on the verge of tears in the middle of the locker room. And then you have, Roy comes up, doesn't say a word, just hugs him, and then he breaks down. Jamie breaks down. And it's a beautiful and very powerful moment, I thought, the way that played out. Because it could have played out in a much different way. But the grief that is allowed to sort of hang there in an uncomfortable way, as you see one man who is also not great at vulnerability, comforting him, physically, like hugging him, embracing him was I thought was unexpected and very powerful.
Yeah, like the dad coming into the locker room with this very hypermasculine performance, and it's really kind of set up as like this is a moment within patriarchy for you to prove, like the thing you have to do in this situation is you have to dominate me because I'm coming in and challenging you and putting you down in front of all your community and saying that they're all lower than me as well. You have to protect all of them, and not even protect them, prove to them that you're a man. And the only option here is you have to fight me. By presenting it like, as you said, almost it's out of desperation, and it's actually acknowledging the hopelessness of like that equation. Like there's nothing I can do here but punch you. But the team also doesn't cheer. In a traditional sports film, I think the team might be like in the background being like, get out of here, like, cursing him out and like all that stuff. But the silence, I think, is really effective, if not realistic, but effective, because it shows that, the team's not about this either. The dad thought he was going to come in and be in like a familiar place, and then they kind of like subvert that.
Right.
We did an episode a few months ago talking about season 1. I think that we covered a lot. One of our big topics of conversation was representations of characters of color. And then we also talked about Danny and how he was also underused and a bit stereotyped. And Danny comes back and has a bit more to do, but maybe not enough.
This is my area, is thinking about representations of various people of Latin American descent, specifically Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And so I had heard that Danny Rojas was going to have a larger role in the second season. And so with bated breath, I watched that first episode, and it was just incredibly disappointing. I mean, I think in general, the actor who portrays Danny Rojas is really great. I really enjoy watching him. But the character of Danny Rojas, he is kind of a collection of stereotypes at this point. He is superstitious. He's also religious. He is very childlike. There's this kind of somber funeral episode at one point, and yet he's like a baby and can't wear dress shoes, which also doesn't match with the religious stereotype, right? Because if you're a religious Mexican, then you've been wearing dress shoes since before you could walk. But either way. And so in this first episode, we see him experience this tragedy. He inadvertently kills a dog, right? He's trying to make this penalty kick, and then he kills this dog by hitting it in the head.
I almost turned off the whole show after that. I was like, oh man. I feel like if you're going to kill a cute animal, like you better be for some really good reason. And I don't think that there was.
It was a plot device just to get us Dr. Sharon. And, I love Dr. Sharon, and so I'm not going to complain too much about it. But really, they did a disservice to that poor dog and to the character of Danny Rojas. Because, in the course of one episode, we see him experiencing this extremely traumatic event, right? You've killed a living animal inadvertently.
And the mascot of the team.
Yes, right. This is like a family member, right? This is, of course, very upsetting. And so we see him. He's in the shower. He's saying his Hail Marys in Spanish. He's trying to wash the death off of it. He says soccer is no longer life. Soccer is death, right? So he is very upset by this. And yet somehow Dr. Sharon can come in, and in the course of maybe, I don't know, it looks like a day and a half on the show. I'm not even sure. He's completely fine. He seems to be cured miraculously.
What he has learned, the entirety of his character development appears to be that he has gone from football is life to football is death, but also football, but mostly life.
Yes, that's his epiphany. Yeah, that's his epiphany. Which, I will say is just a little bit disappointing, because if this is a character who is from Mexico, I think most people who are at least from the Southwest of the United States will know that Mexican culture and their ideas about death are very interesting and unique. And there's a lot to explore there. That was lacking. And instead, it just seems like Dr. Sharon flipped a magic switch and he was totally fine. Does make him seem very shallow. Right. It does make him seem like he doesn't have a lot of emotional depth.
If you really think about Danny's storyline, it kind of makes the other parts about, growth and therapy feel less powerful, because, they don't want you to think about it too much. I think that's why once they introduce that plot device to get Dr. Sharon in, they don't go back, because if you did, he has to have this like big journey, because it's actually a deep trauma.
Yeah, and they completely ignore it, because, in the funeral scene, right, where the episode is dealing entirely with death, rather than him addressing this whole lingering thing of football was death for a time. He is just the comic relief, and his feet hurt, and he has to put on Rebecca's slippers. I mean, he's a joke, and he acts like a child. It's just incredibly disappointing. I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah, and it is disappointing. And I think we can contrast that with, it's hard to talk about Nate because he is in the middle of his trajectory. Mm-hmm. I assume because of the way the show
seems like it will be, season 3 will be a redemption season for Nate.
Right.
We're calling it. Can we all agree? Yes.
Yeah, even the showrunners have joked that season 2 is Empire Strikes Back and season 3 will be Return of the Jedi. So we're definitely going to see that. I mean, the show has a very strong theme relating to redemption. So I think Nate will be redeemed. I mean, that's the guess. Nate's character is a complicated character. The issues that he has, they seem contradictory almost, because on the one level, he's very egotistical, right? He wants to be the boss. He loves being talked about. He loves being the center of attention. He loves getting all the credit, right? So he has this sort of
scrolling through all his tweets about him, right?
Yeah, it's very this sort of megalomaniac almost. But at the same time, resting right with that is deep insecurity and self-hatred.
Yes. Right. The number of times that he spits at himself in the face in a mirror. That kind of self-degradation is a very strange.
Well, he gets not the best advice from Rebecca and Keely on that. I mean, because it starts with like that scene where Rebecca's like, the way I go into a meeting and make myself bigger is I literally, do this like monster thing in the mirror, just fake it till you make it, basically. And like, if you go into the bathroom and build yourself up, then you'll have that confidence. But then the twist, I guess, is that Nate's version of building himself up is spitting at himself, which I think comments on his idea of what a man is and what it means to be a man, which I thought was really powerful, actually, in the sense of like, that is very much often what we're taught about, being a man, is that like, to be a man, you have to dominate other men and other people. You have to put yourself above others. So if you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you're saying, I'm a man, what do you do? And he puts himself down. And I think that the show makes a good comment there, that that's the only way to, fill that role, is to have a bit of self-hatred.
I would like to say that the advice that Rebecca gave of making how she makes herself big, and she kind of gets these claws out and her fangs, and I think that's actually pretty good advice. And I've heard that advice quite a few times, and I hear it especially shared among women of color. And I do think it comes with this idea of like, we're not the prey here. We're not going to be preyed on anymore. We're not going to be seen as lesser or as smaller. And so I think it works if you're coming to it with the right frame of reference, right? But if you're prone to be a predator to begin with, you don't want to then lean into your predator nature.
So we had talked about in our previous episode, we had talked about that scene where Nate gains his confidence and goes from being the kit man to being an assistant coach by going into the locker room and belittling all of the team members, right? And telling it like it is, and essentially being an asshole, right?
Spitting in their faces, basically, right?
Dominating them. That is, in the first season, presented as just a positive thing. There's no sense that that's a problem. Now, we on the podcast had said that's a problem. And it's interesting to me that it seems like in season 2, the writers maybe reconsidered. From the first episode, like from the jump, we see Nate belittling Will, who has his old job. And you see the other coaches looking at each other like, oh, this is a problem, right? The interesting thing here is that it goes from Nate being on this journey to gain confidence in himself, which is, I think a positive thing. That's a worthwhile journey. It becomes clear that it's not just confidence that he's after. It is domination. It is, he wants to be, to me, it feels like a comment on sort of internalized male entitlement. That intersection of lack of confidence, sort of lack of self-respect, and need for validation and domination, or the quest for domination, sort of coupled with this entitled feelings, is a dangerous space. I mean, that's the adorkable misogynist kind of problem that we have in our society, where these men who don't feel themselves to be masculine enough lash out because they want to be that thing that they feel like they aren't.
Yeah, and they give it some context, which I think is important, which is his home life, his relationship to his father.
Right, who doesn't give him any encouragement or any praise at all.
The interaction with the father, of course, the father is not loving. He is not supportive, but he also doesn't seem like a villain, right? And so he seems kind of indifferent, right? So whereas other fathers are seen as very, very violent or abusive, we see this father who is abusive in his neglect.
I mean, I think what's interesting to me about that, and I might be reading too far into it for the show and my own life, but I felt like his dad had there was like some sort of implication there that his dad has had a lot of life experience in being disappointed by the system, the world in which they live. He's not impressed by much because, my community might say is like, well, you have to be a superstar. You have to do that. That's like the bare, minimum to survive. It's like, you have to be the smartest person and do all this. And you have to follow the cultural traditions and in some cases the religious expectations. So, his dad's not going to be impressed by much, potentially because he's had to go through a lot to just make it in this country. I also wanted to say though, is like, what's interesting, if the show goes here, I think it would be great. I don't know if it will in season 3, but Nate's also reacting to the like baseline norm of the sports environment in which he works, which the show often doesn't comment on, but is actually representing, which is that like your heroes in the show they're all physically fit, thin-ish people. They have, for the most part, partners who are also thin. And it's presenting this idea, whether it's commented on or not, that to be a hero, to be a leader, you have to fulfill these different categories. So when Nate makes a move on Keely in one of the key moments that like leads to his point of no return, I guess, in the show, is when he tries to kiss or does kiss Keely without her consent. He's wearing his suit. He's trying to hold on to the fame and the power he got from the the coaching move he made.
And he's wearing Roy's suit very specifically.
Yes, that's right. So he's trying his best to play the role that the show itself sets up for him, or the world of the sports institution sets up for him. Like, this is how you're going to be a man. The people around him are actually embodying some of these things too. And I think for Nate overall, I don't know if the show gets it across clearly enough. He's constantly frustrated by that. Like, he's like, I'm doing what makes me a man, but you keep telling me I can't be that. You know, his frustration is tied to this, like, if you can just play these roles, you should get the reward, which is that entitlement piece. But I think if the show has the room for it, it would be good to make that connection more directly to the actual institution in which he works.
Can I say that, I really, really hated that scene where he kisses Keely without her consent. In every sense, I hated that scene. And I can see what I believe they were trying to do, right? And they do it later, again, where he confesses to Roy, oh, I kissed your girlfriend, I kissed Keely. And Roy was like, it's no big deal, it doesn't matter, right? But Keely's response specifically was awful, and it was quite similar. Oh, no, it's fine. It's okay. And it totally was not fine. And, part of it seems like, oh yeah, they're trying to play it off like she doesn't think it's a big deal. It's like being kissed by a little boy, and little boys are cute. They don't mean you any harm. But that's not what's happening. He's not a little boy. He's a grown man, as much as they're infantilizing him in this show. He's a grown man, and he assaulted a woman. But the way that they portray that act as something that was not a big deal because of who he was, it's not okay. It's not okay, even if their goal was to paint him in that particular light.
When Keely and I went shopping the other day, I kissed her.
Yeah, she told me about it. It's okay.
I kissed her. I kissed your girlfriend.
We good.
All Jamie did was talk to me and you wanted to kill him. Do you at least want to headbutt me or something?
You made a mistake, Nate. Don't worry about it.
No, I deserve to be headbutted.
I'd be happy to headbutt you, Nate.
What's interesting about this, like, what actually pushes Nate over the edge in the end is the fact that Roy says it's okay.
Yeah.
Because Nate wants it to be not okay, because he wants to be punished and like...
Right.
Nate wants to be seen as a threat to Roy. He wants Roy to punch him. I don't know if because he wants to be punished. I think he wants to be seen as masculine enough to be threatening to Roy's relationship. Because he wants to be a man. And he even brings up Jamie, and he's like, Jamie also, transgressed your relationship by saying he loves Keely, and you were threatening to kill him, but you'd not threatened to kill me. And that Roy doesn't treat him in the same way, it infuriates him. I mean, this is, I think we're getting to some of the core parts of the toxicity that can be masculinity in our culture. Here we have a character who wants to get into a violent confrontation over a woman with another man because it will make him feel, even if he gets pummeled, it'll make him feel more manly. And that is how twisted masculinity is in our culture.
And his just total disregard for Keely. Like, he doesn't really want a friend, and she's being a friend to him.
Yeah, she's just being decent. She's being a nice, decent person. And he's like, either you're a sexual partner or you're nothing.
He's so involved in what's going on in his head that he treats her like nothing. And then I do agree that the show doesn't come back to it, which is a huge problem. And I feel like in the next season, they have to come back to it, or they have to have Keely say more about like what her experience is, because what you do get is that Nate's disregarding Keely.
They could take it in a whole bunch of different directions. I think Felicia's point is a good one. Like she is trying to make Nate feel better for assaulting her in that scene.
It's disturbing.
And this seems like the kind of thing the show would address. So the lack of it being even commented on, I thought was striking.
Yeah, I mean, I agree.
And we're done.
What you were saying, Felicia, about Becca's lesson for Nate about like, make yourself big, because, that's one way of navigating these spaces that aren't made for us, I think that that's a good point, but I think that for me, that's where Rebecca's character, because of her position and power in the world, gets more complicated. And the advice coming from Rebecca is different than it coming even from Keely, because from Rebecca, it strikes me as like kind of that lean in feminism idea that like literally, just lean in and it'll be fine. And Rebecca, to the credit of the show, that is Rebecca's perspective on a lot of things, is like, she's just kind of like, oh, why would that be hard? I'm rich. She says like something like, why don't you just buy the restaurant if you can't get a seat at the table, So one of the things that doesn't come up in the show a lot is money as it relates to that team. I mean, we have this Ghanaian billionaire, but like, I did a little bit of research on like the average English Premier League team, which I know that they're on the lower end here, but the average one is worth $1 billion. So even if they're on the lower end, this is a mega business,
Yeah.
And
some of the players have Ferraris or Lamborghinis or something too. So
yeah, and they try to make us sympathize with her through the Christmas episode, and we don't have to talk too much about the Christmas episode, but what I didn't love about that was that it was like she's like the benevolent capitalist person who goes around and gives charity to Tiny Tim or whatever. I don't know all the Christmas lingo, but the reason that comes up for me is it connects to some of this other stuff about girl boss feminism.
Do you want to quickly define girl boss feminism for our audience here?
Yeah, just this idea that like under patriarchy, that a way to escape it is to replicate in many ways the dominance and power of men. So within that, like making enough money to have power within the patriarchal system, it's very much tied to whiteness, because it's often white women who already have power. They're tangentially, they're sitting at the table, as in this case Rebecca is. And so I just think her position is much more complicated than it shows up in the show. And then I just feel like that, combined with just the show's overall lack of acknowledging money, I don't know. I feel complicated about Rebecca. I don't know how you all feel, but
yeah. Well, I mean, there is definitely a class element that is hinted at, but largely missing in terms of critique. When she meets Sam and they find out they've been talking anonymously on that dating app, she says at first, I'm your boss, but then it quickly transitions into I'm too old for you. While the age difference is significant and there is power dynamic issues in that, for me, the bigger power issue is that she's his boss. She literally owns the team he plays on. If the genders had been reversed, it's exactly the kind of issue that the show's writers would probably address, and quite harshly.
And, they do reverse it, not exactly, but they do to some degree with Rupert. We're supposed to be very critical of that relationship, right?
Rupert and his new wife,
his
Becca.
new Becca, right? And they now have a child. She says that she sleeps in the crib or something with the baby, right? They're kind of highlighting the fact that she is like a baby compared to him. And yet, while that relationship kind of reviles us, we can look at Rebecca and Sam, and we, from my perspective, I'm like, oh no, this is not okay. The show frames it in a way where you want them to be happy, you want them to be together, and they are very intentional about trying to make it seem like they're on an even playing field, and they're not at all. Intellectually, they may be, but in terms of a power dynamic, they are not.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I was like shocked that they let that one pass. That they're not going to talk about the power dynamic of a boss dating an employee.
Well, especially because at the time, I mean, during that period, Sam's debating whether or not to take another job. He's in this relationship with a person who determines to some extent, his paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
But the show doesn't really thread the connections there of like, there was an opportunity there, I guess, just to like have a conversation about how those things, there's a conflict of interest. But yeah, they don't really talk about
Well,
it.
and I mean, they make Rebecca and they make Sam so likable, and they make that relationship seem so healthy, from a superficial standpoint, that they remove all the power dynamics there. And so the audience is on board and they want it to happen.
Since, we're talking about the Sam and Rebecca a la Cheers relationship. The rom-communism.
Gentlemen, believing in rom-communism is all about believing that everything's going to work out in the end. If all those attractive people with their amazing apartments and interesting jobs, usually in some creative field, can go through some lighthearted struggles and still end up happy, then so can we.
Which is such an interesting way that they brought it up as a topic, right? I'm a communist, a rom-communist, right? It was just very strange.
Which, from my perspective, as someone who spends a lot of time watching romantic comedies to critique them, being a rom-communist is way worse than being a communist.
Totally, yeah. One of the things I always think about is that, romantic comedies are positioned as films for women. But I think one of the things that often isn't discussed is just like all of Hollywood, historically, the most popular romantic films were written by men and they're directed by men. Nora Ephron aside, a majority of the top romantic comedies of all time are, men's perspective on romance. One of the most obnoxious examples of that is Love Actually, but the show parallels and connects itself to Love Actually a couple times, including in Christmas episode, they do the whole card outside the door thing. We could have a whole episode on romantic comedy, so I don't know if I have time
for sure
to break all that down.
Right. Well, I mean, it seems like they are paying homage to a lot of these romantic comedies. I mean, they name drop a lot of them. They talk about Bridget Jones' Diary. They quote Jerry Maguire. They obviously, like you're saying, Love Actually comes up a whole bunch of times.
They have a brainstorming session where they're trying to think of all of their famous the rom-com leads.
Yeah. So, I mean, it feels like homage, right? I mean, as people who study media, we know that romantic comedies have some of the most toxic relationship dynamics of any kind of movie. Because of the behavior is often framed as harmless and yet is quite damaging, quite harmful.
Yeah. So the thing that I think is troubling about the emphasis on romantic comedies in the show is that romantic comedies are a genre which historically have emphasized the perspective on love, which is so limiting. It's the idea that it's just between a man and a woman, and in most cases led by the man. And in this show, there's so many opportunities to break free from that. There are even romantic comedies now, like in the last 20 years, that you could reference that break away from that. But the show very much is referencing key markers of, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, of those films which were reinforcing what I think are harmful ideas of heteronormativity and mostly white, almost all white. They mentioned Jennifer Lopez. I think Danny's the one who
Danny.
Yeah, Jennifer Lopez.
And not to be too late, right?
Exactly. But for the most part, they're talking about these films that are between a white man and a white woman. And I think that's significant to the limitations of the show's vision of romance. Even when it's between Sam and Rebecca, it connects to all these things of not talking about power and not talking about these different dynamics, because that's what happens in romantic comedies.
Right. So, and similarly, that card scene in Love Actually that they adapt for the show is damaging as well, but it's supposed to be funny, but it's really horrifying. I mean, they're threatening a small child. And at one point, Keely's like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And no, not me. But, they are absolutely threatening a child.
Yeah.
In that scene.
On one of the cards, it says, be nice to me or he'll beat you up. And it's like an arrow pointing to Roy, and Roy kind of snarls.
He goes,
at the little kid. It makes me think of how Roy is represented. And, we like Roy. I think, he's a well-written character, and he's quite likable. And I think the reason that he's likable, or he's written to be likable, is by setting up a juxtaposition between the way he acts around Keely and the way he acts around all the other guys. Roy has this sort of very aggressive, confrontational, combative attitude. It's often played for comedy.
What did you think? Did your former club play well?
I thought they played like shit. They were too timid. They were too respectful of United. They were lucky they didn't lose by 3 or 4 or 10.
That's harsh, Roy. United's been on a good run recently.
Who gives a shit, Chris?
It's how you do it.
I enjoy his candor.
Again, we apologise for almost every word Roy just said.
He's a pundit on the sports show, and it's taken by the audience within the context of the show as being authentic. Finally, this guy, there's someone on talking about football who's being authentic, because he's being aggressive, because he's cursing all the time, because he's putting people down. And that translates to his coaching style. And the way that he engages with other players is also aggressive and combative. And the reason we're supposed to like him is because when he is challenged on something, he just says, fuck, and then storms off. And then he goes and he does something really sweet and very thoughtful and gives Keely her space. And it's great. I mean, his relationship with Keely is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
His relationship with everybody else, other than his niece, his relationship with all the other men is awful,
Mm-hmm.
even when it's trying to be sweet. There's this scene where he confronts Jamie about Jamie having told Keely that he's still in love with her. And they're about to fight. I mean, this is how it's set up. And then before they can get into it, Jamie just apologizes and says, I respect you. I respect your relationship. And then Roy has this realization that he can't just punch him and knock his teeth out, which he had threatened to do. And he storms off. And then later he says, I forgave him. But we didn't see him forgive Jamie. He had this internal realization. He said, fuck, and he walked away.
Right. And until later, when he wants to have a positive moment with Jamie. And then in order to have that positive moment after they've won a game, he then physically assaults him. And he's like, why did you do that? And then he gives him a big hug.
He says very specifically, he says, so I could do this. And then he hugs him. And he has already said, I have forgiven him. And the only way he can reestablish this sort of physical bond is by assaulting him. And the show does not critique that at all. We are supposed to think that this is just the way that men have to deal with things. But it also wants us to be super impressed that he forgave him, but then he didn't forgive. You know what I mean? It's trying to have it both ways.
Yeah.
And Jamie shows way more growth than Roy does in that situation.
I was just going to say, it's almost like the character's kind of painted into a corner in that way, because what makes Roy, his thing is that he's this guy who's about to beat you up, but then breaks expectations. And I wonder what they're going to do if he's now in the coaching role and he's in a more of a leadership role. Is his self-growth and journey now to understand that the power his example has, or maybe something like that? But I'm curious.
I thought that they were hinting at further emotional growth for him because of the Diamond Dogs group and him initially not wanting to be a part of it. And then at the end of the season saying, can I get some advice? They kind of bring him into the Diamond Dogs and him not being dissatisfied with it. He thought it was going to be awful and he's like, oh, that's not so bad. But, it looks like at least they're trying to show that Roy is beginning to make some progress in communicating with men. We know he can communicate with women, right? He has his group of women that he does yoga with or whatever else, right? Which again, I think is part of that, what they're doing in trying to get us to like him because of his internal contradictions, right? His seeming contradictions. But hopefully he will be able to communicate his feelings without violence to other men in the next season.
Having an aggressive, combative, hyper-masculine persona in public is a problem that the show doesn't seem to be able to come to terms with, at least from my perspective. I feel like in some ways the show backtracked on that. I mean, there's a couple scenes that made me sit up and go, wait a second. One of them was when Roy tells Ted that he's ruined Jamie as a player by making him too considerate and thoughtful, and that he needs to be a prick. I mean, that idea that in order to be a good athlete, you have to be a prick. You have to get into the other players' heads. You got to psych them out. You have to dominate them, and that's a good thing. There was that, and then there was another scene where Dr. Sharon tells Ted that he's created a really supportive and thoughtful community around the team. And Ted is like, well, thank you. And she's like, but you don't win. So it's almost saying that within the context of sports, you can't be supportive all the time because you have to win. The competitive edge that you need requires a level of aggression and a level of combativeness. And they're not saying that, these players should just be a jerk all the time, but they are saying it's useful and necessary to win in the institution of sports.
I was just going to add that in the end, Roy comes back to the stadium. He goes inside that world because he can't do that stuff out there. Anyways, I just think I hadn't thought about that before, but they basically bring him back into the world where he can be that.
Right. Where his aggressiveness is an asset. There's this concept of the magic circle within game spaces, digital spaces, but also in terms of sports. There's this idea that you need to be an aggressive, macho figure on the field. And what you do there won't affect your home life. It won't affect your relationship. There's this separation that people want to have. And we see that with Roy. He can be this aggressive guy on the field when he's coaching or when he's playing. But then when he goes home to Keely, he can be nice and sweet, and there's no bleed over there. But there is. I mean, you are not two separate people just because you're on a field.
Yeah.
And my feeling is that maybe the show can't square that. I mean, if the hyper competitiveness and the hyper aggressiveness and the hyper masculinity of professional sports is pushing men to be angry and aggressive with other men on the field, then that might be a problem with the institution of competitive sports.
Yeah. And I think with soccer, it's so interesting because it is a team sport and people call it the beautiful game. And I think the show uses that metaphor often. Here's a team, they have to pass to each other in order to score, to win. But then it doesn't really get into like the darker side of professional soccer. Think about this one example of like from the World Cup. I forget what year it was. It was like in the 2000s at some point, but this French player, Zinedine Zidane, who was like considered like the best player in the world at the time. But in the biggest game of the World Cup, he lost it and he headbutted somebody and was ejected from the game and had a red card and like lost his team the thing. But that moment, I remember watching it as a younger person, it was like shocking. I mean, this happens in sports all the time, like these sudden, very like violent things. And the announcers, they will use similar rhetoric to justify it, like, oh, the heat of the moment, emotions got the best of him, those kinds of things. But, I think that's the complicated thing the show has to get into is like you can have this beautiful game, but then the institution and the way that it's living within patriarchal stuff, also has a really violent and scary side to it in the real world. So I think they might have to get to that through Roy's character a bit. We'll see. I don't know.
I'm not particularly hopeful that they will. I mean, I feel like the show is trying to have it both ways with Roy.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like there's a contradiction between what the game of football wants of men and what Ted is trying to create that is actually in conflict and can't help but be, at least to my mind.
I agree with you. And I don't think they will try to eliminate those contradictions. I don't even know if they're aware of those contradictions. I mean, I think it's really interesting that they're critical of the way Ted is dealing with his emotions, right? That he's bottling things up. He's kind of dishonest about things with the people around him. And yet we have an episode where specifically he's saying, don't let your opponents know the truth. Don't let them see that you're tired, right? And that's exactly what he's doing through the whole thing, right? He is not letting anyone see how he feels, right? He's hiding it from everyone as much as he can. They're critical about it with Ted, but not with sports. That's a normal part of coaching. That is something that everyone's going to say, of course, you're going to deceive them as much as you can. What's okay on the sports field is not okay in a relationship. I don't think they'll be critical of that at all in the next season.
Well, they already have a straw man in Nate.
Ah, right.
He's going to be the villain coach versus the...
He's Darth Vader. The villain is still Rupert. So
yeah. I mean,
he's the
Rupert
emperor.
is the emperor. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the show's still very, very interesting and entertaining to watch, but to these questions of whether they're going to get there, I don't know anymore.
Yeah, it really is a mixed bag. I mean, you get some really rare depictions of men struggling with their masculinity and what's expected of them. And then in other ways, the show just sort of reinforces it without question.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it feels a little bit arbitrary. I think we're trying to, part of this podcast is to try to deconstruct it and figure out which things they're willing to address and which things they're not. And I think season 3 will give us an opportunity to do that further. So I hope you'll both come back and join me for that conversation.
Looking forward to the end of the trilogy here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Please remember that all of our pop culture detective projects are 100% funded by listeners and viewers like you, so you won't hear a bunch of ads or sponsorships on this podcast. If you do enjoy the kind of in-depth media analysis that you just heard, please consider going over to Patreon to support our work. Just go to patreon.com/popdetective. As always, you can keep up to date with our projects on Twitter @popdetective, and find all of our long-form video essays on the Pop Culture Detective YouTube channel. And there will be a new video up soon, so keep an eye out for that. We'll be back again very soon with another audiophile investigation. So until then, please remember to follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many, many other platforms. Thanks again for listening.